For nearly 10 years, the wide-angle zoom was my preferred lens of choice for virtually every landscape which I shot. I loved the way it handled the perspective of a scene, the way it could distort reality, the way that when used properly, it could make the viewer feel like they were actually within the scene. But now, it is a lens that I very rarely use, and whilst I do think it's valuable to own one, if I had to cut my lens choices down to just 2 lenses, it would definitely be the one to go. Of course, the lens hasn't changed, my way of seeing has changed. Perhaps I prefer reality, but that's not to say that the wide-angle zoom is a lens which I would want to be without. It's times like this that a wide-angle lens really comes into its own. A wide-angle lens generally works best when you've got a good strong foreground, or even better, a good strong foreground which also leads somewhere. And the wide-angle lens is really good at distorting perspective a little bit, exaggerating it perhaps more accurately. So if you've got a nice leading line like the jetty behind me, what you can do is actually exaggerate that length and almost make the jetty appear longer than it actually is, but it definitely makes it look more dramatic. Now I've got here about 7 o'clock, the light's not great, and I've just checked an app on my phone and I can see the sun's going to rise from behind me. So what I'm hoping is I'm going to come back here at 5 o'clock in the morning and photograph this jetty with my Canon EOS R and the 16-35 on it. There's an obvious benefit to using a wide-angle lens, and that is simply to fit more within the frame. Sometimes you can visit a location and it's simply too big to fit within the frame when using a standard zoom. I've just taken a shot of the jetty in the boathouse. I used the 16-35mm lens at the widest setting, which allowed me to get the jetty and the boathouse within the frame. However, what I could have done is I could have taken 2 or 3 different shots using the 24mm side of a standard zoom and then stitched them together, and that would have worked and perhaps would have served the purpose quite well for this sort of shot. But you know, there's a problem with stitching, and the problem with stitching is if you've got anything moving in it. Today behind me there's nothing particularly, but if you think moving clouds or moving water, especially on a seascape, sometimes stitching just isn't a logical thing to do. Now, when using a wide-angle lens, as I said earlier, it exaggerates perspective. But what that means is it will also weaken your foreground unless you are straight over it. With a wide-angle lens, you need to be as close as possible to that foreground to get maximum impact. And that's when they work at the best. Most of the time when I see shots which haven't worked when taken with a wide-angle zoom, it's simply because they weren't close enough to the foreground. It's essentially important. With a wide-angle lens, in some ways, concentrate more on your foreground than anything else to start off with. Find a strong foreground. Get yourself a location. Move around until you exaggerate that perspective on that foreground as much as possible. I think you can start to see where I'm going with this. A wide-angle lens is all about exaggerating perspective. There's a real risk when using a wide-angle zoom that a lot of your shots will start to look very similar after a while. As I said earlier, I used to use this wide-angle zoom most of the time for my landscape shots. And what I was starting to find is that I was using the exaggerating perspective all the time, which in some ways made me lazy. And lazy is not good. I don't like being lazy. So I much prefer using this 24-105, so I can move backwards and forwards a little bit with my feet and work a little bit harder. I think it's the same as any sort of technique in photography. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you can do it all the time. So yes, a wide-angle zoom is very useful, but it's not the be and end all by any means. One particular no-go area for wide-angle zooms is people. The wide-angle zoom is not a portrait lens. It can be useful to get people within the frame if you've got a large scene, and perhaps other people quite small, But whatever you do, don't have them towards the edges because you'll find that they'll start to distort a little bit. And definitely don't take a portrait of your mother-in-law shot at 16mm with it straight in the face. Really, you will not earn any brownie points. I suppose what I'm trying to say, the wide-angle zoom is really not a portrait lens. If you use it at the widest setting and start to get close to your subject, what you'll find is they will heavily distort and appear a little bit larger than they should be. So, is the wide-angle zoom an important part of the Holy Trinity? It's very useful. It's a useful lens to own. It's not a lens I use very much, but I used to. But I never used to run with a Holy Trinity. I almost used to just have a dynamic duo of two lenses, the 16 to 35mm lens and the 70 to 200, and that used to do me for most of my landscapes. But if you find yourself in a situation where you only want to take one lens, like later I'm going hiking in the Lake District and I'm probably going to take just the 24 to 105 because it's a good all-rounder. If I had to keep my bag down to only two lenses, I would definitely go for a standard zoom and then a 70 to 200 or 70 to 300, something like that. So only really if I've got the space to carry three lenses will I carry the 16 to 35. So for me, the 16 to 35mm lens is my weak spot in the Holy Trinity. It is the one, if I'm going overseas, I would probably leave at home. And to put this into context, I went to New Zealand last year and I actually took the 16 to 35. Didn't use it once. So that sort of speaks volumes. For me, it's all about the way you see sometimes. And as I said earlier, although it's not really a question we prefer in reality, I prefer to not distort and exaggerate perspective all the time. I prefer my images to look more natural in the focal length. And for me, the 16 to 35 doesn't give me that unless I'm using it between 24 to 35mm. And if I'm using it between 24 to 35mm, then I may as well just use a 24 to 105 lens. But you know, your needs may be different. So, whilst I wouldn't say maybe rush out and invest in one quite yet, definitely hire one or borrow one, give it a try. You may love it. They're useful lenses. They are useful lenses, don't get me wrong, but don't overdo it. I hope you enjoyed this week's video. If you'd like to see more content, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you next week. Bye.